Thanks for staying with us. Police Minister Bheki Cele has blamed DNA testing backlogs on budget cuts caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. He admits that the mismanagement of funds and corruption is also playing a role in the delays. Parliament has heard that the current backlog at the police's forensic laboratory service is sitting at 200,000, which is affecting criminal cases.
The main thing was the redirection of the finances by the Treasury, the Finance Department, where, as we all know, the cuts and all that, the money, for some reason, that was supposed to be put there for operations could not be there. And then there were diversion of the funds. That's one reason. But the other reason is clearly mismanagement of the contracts. One cannot really live out of that. For instance, the contracts expired where you can't get the consumables. The issue of the war between the supplier at the time and the police, withdrawal of those services in June 2020. All those things put together, and sometimes an ordinary corruption of people not doing what they're supposed to do, and then hence there's been some change in the supply chain of the police. There's been some change on the laboratories of the police, and we've put the new management there. Those changes, they convince us that going forward things will be corrected.
And staying with the DNA testing backlogs at police labs, to weigh in on this, we're joined by the Forensic Data Analyst Board Chairperson, Bonani Mufumadi. Good evening, and thank you so much for your time tonight. The Minister blames this on a myriad of issues, but at the heart of it, he's talking about budget cuts, he's talking about the mismanagement of funds, he's also alluding to issues around corruption. Are you convinced that, in fact, this is the reason why we're seeing such a backlog when it comes to DNA tests?
Good evening, and thank you very much for having me on this evening. Yes, the Minister is right that this is a result of many factors involved. Where it concerns our company, FDA, as a supplier, the reason is indeed that the police very strangely stopped using our system sometime in June last year. And our system is very centrally involved in the processing of DNA and other evidence and exhibits from scenes of crime. And without our system, it is not possible for the police to process these items efficiently. And so it is no surprise to us that in a matter of weeks, the backlog has increased from 140,000 cases to 208,000 cases.
The Minister talks then about a mismanagement of contracts, and he also alludes to issues around corruption and all of that. Could that be a reason why your contracts may have been terminated, or were you then given reasons, as you say, that your contracts and your services were no longer required?
The Minister is correct about pointing to mismanagement on the side of the police and their partner being CETA, in that in our case, they have completely mismanaged our supply of services, completely mismanaged our relationship with them. Our courts, not once, but 9 times, have told them that they were mismanaging our relationship with them, starting with stopping paying us for services rendered and expecting that they could continue to not pay us for months on end and still use our services. So that was a classical case of mismanagement, failure of leadership on the part of SAPS and CETA with regard to our case, as indeed with regard to other suppliers, as the Minister said, suppliers of consumables to the laboratories and so forth, whose goods and services were not procured on time, were never procured at all, and so services came to a halt. and that is behind this backlog that South Africans are suffering today.
And the minister is saying that, there's somewhat around 60,000 cases that have been received at the labs but are yet to be analyzed. Talk to us then about, the difference that your systems would have then made in terms of this particular analysis, and also ensuring that this backlog that appears to be growing and not going down is then contained.
So that is an additional 60,000 cases in a matter of a few weeks. And where our system is concerned, that happens because what our system does is when these exhibits are brought to the laboratories, our system is used, or was used, I should say, to record those exhibits, process them, manage them, and have them presented in court when those cases come up in court. Now, when that system is not available because the police have chosen to not use it anymore for no reasons at all, when that system is not available, it is no longer possible to do all of those things with the exhibits, with the evidence when the same arrive at the laboratories. And so the cases just pile up. And after a few weeks, you have 60,000 cases added to the 140,000 cases. Now what the police told Parliament and the public yesterday is that they have developed, alternative to our system, overnight, a new system, which will see them deal with this backlog over a period of 18 months. Now I ask you, can this bar be, go any lower? This is asking victims of crime, victims of rape and other crimes, to wait for 18 months before the police look at their file, their docket, and determine whether there's a suspect in the matter, whether the evidence contained in those files may be used in court. Why should the public settle for such leadership of the police? Are there really no other South Africans who can do a better job of this? Other South Africans who can do real competent policing? There are 52 million of us in the land. Surely there must be people who can do a better job than ask victims of crime to wait 18 months before their files are looked at.
It sounds to me like you're saying that, from what you're talking about, that 18 months and of course, the internal capacity for the SAPs to then be able to develop such a system and be able to analyze these particular specimen, if I can put it like that. Are you then doubting the capability of the SAPS to be able to develop its own internal processes in order to be able to try and mitigate this problem, as it says that it's hoping in 18 months it'll be gone?
Well, look at the facts. The leadership of SAPS and the police are telling Parliament and the public that they are solving this problem, that they have turned around this terrible situation of non-delivery. But the image in the mirror shows very differently. This so-called system that they have suddenly and overnight developed can only manage less than 10% of what is required, of what our system does or used to do when they were using it. Now, how is such a system going to be able to undertake such a mammoth task as sits before them? It's no wonder then that we are growing in backlog from 140,000 to 208,000 in a matter of weeks. Somehow we are asked to look at that as progress, a growth in backlog by 60,000 cases. The police say to us, that's progress. Well, let's look even at specific cases right now. There's a case in Mafikeng going on right now, related to the overall state capture issues going on in the country. It's a fraud case. Right there in that court in Mafikeng, the police are unable to present to the court what we call credible evidence, exhibits that may not be challenged by the accused. because they're using this so-called magical system they developed overnight as opposed to our system. The risk they face, or the reality.
If I can come in there, pardon me, if I can just ask you, as us laymen who are trying to understand, the inner workings of the system, are you then able to paint a picture for us as plainly as possible to tell us what are the differences between your system and the current system that you are criticizing, which you're saying then that is not as effective, and even as you use that example of that particular court case in Mahikeng?
So they call their new system FEM. And all what that system, and they themselves, before Parliament, describe it as a simple track and trace system, as opposed to the complex system that we used to supply to them. And all that their system does is record or register the exhibits when they arrive through the front door into the labs. That's all that it does. Whereas our system, PICM, used to record those exhibits when they arrived at the labs, process them, manage them, print the necessary reports required in court when investigating officers appear before court to give evidence against the accused. That is the basic or main contrast between the systems. But even more importantly, our system, by contrast to their new magical system, utilizes fingerprints of those people doing the receiving of the evidence and recording it, so that you have an audit trail of who received such evidence, who recorded it, who processed that DNA material, who did they hand it over to, what did they do with it, did they contaminate it, did they manipulate it? So you know who's working on this throughout the process. That's what's known as a chain of custody. All it is about is ensuring credibility and validity of evidence for presentation in court. The new overnight system by the police does none of that. That is why any evidence they will present in court, such as in this case in Mafikeng, is open to challenge by the accused, to the extent of such cases being thrown out against those accused.
So what you're saying, pardon me, yes. So what you're saying then, if I understand you correctly, is that, one, there may not be accountability or sound accountability as to who may have handled that particular kit when coming in and difficult to trace. But secondly, let's talk then about potentially a gender-based violence case, that if it is then handled, then you cannot be able to then track where it ended up, how it became processed. It is possible that then a certain DNA sample may be erroneously linked to a case that it is not supposed to be linked to, and thus then creating a mismatch. Is that what you're saying this is possible here?
That is correct. And furthermore, the police internally would not be able to hold anyone accountable for such mismanagement of the evidence, because they can't say conclusively, Officer Bonani Mufamadi handled these samples, because there are no fingerprints involved to identify me as the officer responsible for the processing of that piece of evidence. Key to any trial of a matter in court.
So what will it take?
The police say to Parliament and the public, we're making progress. It is false progress, because they are not revealing this reality to the public and Parliament.
And what will it take then to reach a point where things are then functioning smoothly, within the SAPS? And should they say, for example, because as the minister rightfully says, that some funds had to be redirected given the COVID-19 pandemic, how then do they begin internally to see if it's possible to have a system like this that is as effective in order to be able to trace, and not only track and trace only, but to also ensure that you're tracing every single step of this particular file and you do everything else that you need to do in order for them to not find themselves in this position where they seem to be empowering criminals, if I can even put it that way, because, knowing that a case is going to take long to be resolved could, lead to some criminals becoming emboldened.
You're absolutely right about that. The fact of the matter is they've been using our system for years, well over a decade. The question is, why have they stopped using it? Why are they now playing these games with the safety of the country's citizens and residents when they've had a system that has served them competently, reliably for well over a decade? Why have they put that aside in favor of something they've developed overnight, which, by the way, is a matter soon to come up before court, because